Let's begin with one of those films. This is certainly the more well-known of our pairing tonight, which is 1975's Rollerball.
Yes, which is set in the futuristic dystopia of Check's Notes 2018. Rollerball introduces us to the most famous practitioner of the titular sport, James Caan's Jonathan E., playing the deadly sport for the Houston team in what would be an international league where nation's still a thing. They've gone out of fashion after apparently some nasty warfare business, with all decisions now left to the care of, well, business, with corporations running the world and your life. And also Jonathan's life, as a corporate bigwig tells him to retire. Most of this film's world building comes through Jonathan's quest to find out why he's being asked to retire, a quest which mostly meets with dead ends and false hope, while getting all the more dangerous for him as he continues to defy his corporate masters. This ultimately leads to a deadlier than usual final game of the season, an already highly dangerous fusion of roller derby, the video game Speedball, with a twist of Roman-era gladiatorial chariot racing, but now with all the rules suspended. Wait, there were rules before? This was, somehow, my first dalliance with Rollerball, at least as far as my adult memory goes, and I'm left a bit torn. On the one hand, I do want to automatically applaud films that don't dump reams of exposition on you, and Rollerball relies on the audience following Jonathan along as he wakes up from the apparent slumber of the decadence people are living in and questioning how the system came to be and how the world really works. On the other hand, I'm not convinced Johnny Boy actually finds a great many answers, so you're left to fill the gaps yourself with a lack of information that encourages more idle guessing than informed speculation. I mean, that whole consulting the world's central computer and its mad scientist keeper sequence practically rubs your nose in its refusal to be drawn in any kind of answer. That aside, there's not much of a concrete message other than corporations bad, freedom good. And while we're here, we should also point out that the world corporations are currently building has little in common with what Rollerball is serving us. However, even if I didn't appreciate the answers or lack of them, I was drawn along well enough by the question. On the more nuts and bolts level, I say this more or less holds up. The sport itself makes for some fun action sequences, although I could maybe have done with them being cut back a little, but then again, it is sort of the basis of the film. Director Norman Jewison keeps things moving along well enough for the era, although bear in mind this is pre-Star Wars 70s sci-fi, so expect a very different pacing from more modern works. James Caan's fine in the role, but the character doesn't have all that much of an opportunity to either grow or really show much emotion, although those few opportunities are grabbed well enough. Cinematography from Douglas Slocum keeps things interesting, even if the far-flung future of Rollerball's 2018 holds little relation to the historical record. So then, I don't regret watching this, and there's enough interesting ideas here to give this recommendation, but it didn't really blow my doors off.
I was adamant that we had, at least in passing, mentioned this film some time ago, because I feel like I remember a conversation we had where I said to you guys that I kind of had a fondness for Rollerball because it's one of maybe two films I can think of that I sat and watched just my dad and I. And I can't remember what the circumstances were, but I think I must have been like about 12 or something, and the women folk of the house were out at some function or another, and I remember we were browsing through the channels, but I was like, oh, Rollerball, you'll like that. And we sat and watched it together, and I've maybe watched it a couple of times since then, and each time I've watched it, I feel like maybe I've enjoyed it a little bit more, and I actually really, really enjoyed it this time. I don't know that James Caan necessarily is the right person for this role, or certainly the direction that he's being given. Like you say, Scott, I think the sort of relative lack of emotion from him is perhaps in keeping with the very downbeat tone of the film, but it doesn't necessarily make for scintillating watching. I don't find Jonathan all that engaging as a character, and I don't necessarily understand why the crowds attending the matches are quite so behind him, or how he's gathered this sort of like cult, momentum among the fans of the sport and whatnot. But there's enough of interest that happens in the film. Like you say, I appreciate the fact that it doesn't necessarily go about spelling everything out. There are one or two references in there that are a little bit clunky perhaps, but for the most part it treats the audience with some modicum of intelligence. There was a couple of attempts at humour that I kind of appreciated, like the computer, was it called Zero again? I'd almost completely forgotten that scene with Zero, and I had a proper chuckle to myself at the notion that this computer that's relied upon as a repository basically for all human knowledge for the entire planet has accidentally lost the 13th century. But if I've got one major criticism of Rollerball, it's quite how fragile these big burly players seem to be, because in all honesty they go down like a sack of potatoes at the slightest contact during these matches. And let's be honest, if falling over on a pair of roller skates was quite this detrimental to people's health, the human race would not have survived the 70s. So that aside, I still feel like there's a good deal to enjoy about Rollerball. I appreciate the fact that I'm wearing sort of nostalgia-tinted glasses, but I do feel that objectively I quite enjoyed it this time round. And I'm now going to listen to Drew explain absolutely no uncertain terms why he feels the absolute opposite.
Well, I don't feel the opposite. I'm probably quite close to where Scott is in this. I had a notion I had seen Rollerball, actually, and it turns out I hadn't. Although
I'm sure we spoke about it, but I don't know. It was maybe entirely unrelated to the podcast.
It's possible. I don't remember the conversation, I'm afraid, Craig, so I can't say yay or nay to that.
Yeah, I've searched the archives Sorry, Drew. I've searched the archives relatively thoroughly, and it's not been part of the schedule for Fuds on Film or the one-liner that I can find. So
no, I'm pretty sure we didn't mention a podcast. But yeah, I was fairly sure I'd seen it. Turns out I hadn't, although I'd been vaguely aware of it for most of my life, and I think perhaps that Scott referenced it already because of Speedball. That was aware that was somehow inspired by Rollerball. First of all, actually, unusually for this slot, we may actually be able to compare and contrast that here, so I hope I'm not stepping too much on your toes what you're going to say for your introduction to the next film, Craig.
That's all right.
But we mentioned in our first sports film a few years ago, although not in our most recent episode, that most sports films, the sport's not really the point, it's a framework on which to hang another story. And that's very much the case here. And I quite appreciated that because it's very much not the case in the upcoming film.
I may touch upon that very point in my notes, Drew.
And so, yeah, in this case, the sport isn't the point, and the structure of the film actually follows that. Apart from a handful of short training, not even a montage, that's not common for the genre, actually. There's not much of a montage, but a couple of training sequences, but mostly it keeps itself to three main matches, which are far too long, which is one of the problems with it, but for the most part, keeps them in three matches, and it sort of ties into the bigger story, and that works quite well. And what works quite well too, and again, in contrast to the upcoming film, is that, at least in the early stages, this sport, made up as it is, you can understand the purpose, grok fairly quickly, at least the basic framework of the game, understand who's on which team, because they have such things as uniforms, although that kind of falls away to the end, and it falls into the same trap of our next film, where in the end, everybody's just hitting each other. Like, apparently that's what they exist for, rather than to protect other people on their team. But yeah, they do quite a good job of this invented sport of making it fairly easy for an audience to grok, to understand who's in which team, who's doing what. That's all quite good. I just feel that
crucially making it appear that it might actually be a functioning sport.
Yes, exactly. So you look at that, I think that could be real. Yeah, it's a bit over the top in the whole. You're very much right about the fragility of these people, but sorry, I totally lost my train of thought there because I was trying to remember who had said that. Was it you, Scott?
The fragility of people? No, it was myself.
Yeah, so I sort of second guessed myself there. But yes, you're right about the fragility of the people, Craig, but it makes sense. You know, it has a sort of sporty truthiness to it, so that works quite well. And I just feel that for the rest of it, that the sporting parts go on too long. The whole film is at least 30 minutes too long, I would say.
Sporty truthiness, though. Interesting thought, Drew. Hold that thought.
Oh, I haven't let go of that thought in days, Craig. And yeah, there's some interesting ideas. I mean, it falls into the same sort of trap as things like Demolition Man does. And bear with me, I know that's not an obviously immediate comparison point.
You have my attention, Drew.
But it's simply I don't know if it's a lack of ambition or just like not being sufficiently, too cynical perhaps, but the idea that this incredible worldwide change has come about in such an incredibly short time frame. Like the whole world has changed in Demolition Man, yet it's meant to have happened in less than 70 years. In this case, it's 40 odds.
I think that's, in fairness, I was thinking about this and ruminating on it myself the other day. This is a pitfall that all manner of films fall into sci-fi films. Even, I mean, the likes of Blade Runner and whatnot. What was 2019? I think the android-fueled future of Blade Runner was supposed to be like a mere 30 years, if that, from, you know.
Yeah, it's very
Wasn't
common.
Predator 2 set, 4 years from when it was made or something like that?
Yeah, Los Angeles was a war zone.
Yeah.
In 97 that was set, I think, wasn't it?
So,
So it's certainly common within the genre, but the Demolition Man in particular was the one that came to my mind while watching it, was because in that there's like the whole society has completely changed, but in particular it makes the point of like there's one person that John Spartan meets later who's on the force with them, but apparently he's forgotten everything that happened. And in this case, you've got Moses Gunn, who's 46 when he shot this, whose character claims he can remember as a child, which would have been about the time the film was made, given this set in 2018, when there were just 3 nations. Your timeline doesn't work. Not only does it make no sense in the scale of the changes, it doesn't actually work into any terms of time. So that sort of thing tends to take me out. It's like, you've not thought this through well enough. And then, but I mean, there are interesting ideas. The ideas of corporations taking over world is something science fiction comes back to time and again, and it's understandable why. Not always believably done, but you can get it. Although a couple of little things in there that I wonder if they might have played differently to a US audience, because I've always found US club games having national anthems before them super creepy and weird.
Yeah, and the notion that they have corporate anthems here is kind of,
it means nothing to us, because you only get national anthems played for most sports in the world when it's actually an international thing, between 2 nation states playing or something like that. Whereas in the United States in baseball and American football stuff, it's like the national anthem's sung before every single game, even if it's just between 2 clubs, even from the same city, and I find that weird.
And you're not being patriotic if you don't stand to attention.
I'm not going to go off on a tangent there, but because of that culture in the US, I think that corporate anthem thing would have played quite differently. Whereas to me, it's like, I guess. So it's quite interesting, but it's complete refusal to give any answers to the questions of Jonathan E's quest. It's frustrating, and part of me is thinking, okay, I sort of get that, but it kind of leaves the last bit, which ought to really be sort of an FU to the corporations, kind of feeling kind of hollow, because there's so little information there, so little of what's going on behind the scenes, and they'll tease strange little things, like they mention the crocodile. Who's the crocodile? What's the crocodile about?
At the party, because we're supposed to assume that the Evans he refers to is Jonathan, right? Because it's Jonathan E.
You assume it's Jonathan E, yes.
Yeah, but exactly. So, who's got it in for the crocodile? Eh?
Did you hear about Evans? What? He's out, gone. No kidding. The old man? Who got him? What? I said who got him? The crocodile. And that's the last time that's mentioned, and also the first time that's mentioned, and it's just passing at a party. Yeah. Well, that's quite intriguing. And I'd imagined all sorts of things, that perhaps this was a predatory old man who fancied Jonathan Evans and decided he was going to have him. That sort of thing's been on sci-fi. That would be quite sinister in a number of ways and quite interesting. But no, it's not that, because it kind of always felt like possession. I was reading that got as in rather got to him, or who wanted him, because there is some of that in the film, like the wives being sort of traded around. A corporate executive wanted his wife, so she went. So it might happen to the players. It used to happen with gladiators and things, that it would become wanted by wealthy women, and I'm guessing wealthy men too. So I thought it was something like that. But no, it goes nowhere. It's pointless. And that was my big problem in the end, other than that sort of overstays its welcomes. In the end, it was just a bit pointless.
Yeah, I mean, it's going for some sort of, the corporations are afraid that this one individual will show people the value of individuality and lead a revolt that will take over the corporate world or something, but there's a lot of missing steps in that arguargument, and I don't really see how it's actually going to get there.
Yeah, it's the one area that you probably want it to be a little bit more explicit in, right?
Yeah, because it feels like it's trying to head towards an ending where you're going to have, I'm Jonathan E. No, I'm Jonathan E. It has that sort of feel to it. It's like, oh, well, no, it didn't do anything. Well, Guess that was fun.
Yeah, I guess I've always felt like it was pretty explicit that that's the whole notion was that, yeah, the individual can't be bigger than the corporation. I'm sure there's a bit of dialogue here or there regarding that, but I suppose looking at it objectively and removing the fact that obviously I've seen it a couple of times and I've got some fondness for it, and I've done some, I've done a little bit of reading and research into the production of the movie and stuff over the years and whatnot, but it's maybe knowledge I'm sort of bringing from elsewhere into it rather than just stepping back and viewing it objectively for what's on the screen. I can kind of get that, yeah, it's maybe not as explicit as it needs to be, but I really enjoy Rollerball. That party scene, I really like that party scene this time round. It was one of the scenes that hasn't really worked for me previously, but for some reason it kind of clicked. It had a real nightmarish quality, I think, to it that I kind of appreciated this time round. And like you say, Drew, the notion that, well, the corporation took my wife because an executive wanted her, and he basically comes home one day and finds he's got a new girlfriend. She introduces herself. Hi, was it Barbara or something like that?
Daphne. Daphne. That's after he's first one, who's been there for 6 months, who wasn't his wife, like Maud Adams came before that. So he doesn't get any choice in it. And I mean, the idea of like individual freedom and choice, that's sort of the central theme, that like just because you have all your needs catered for, if you don't have choice and liberty, then you don't really have anything. And I get that. I just don't think the film did it strongly enough. And then
I also, sorry, Drew. Sorry.
Also, as you were saying too, it does mention that it's when the John Houseman, who, like James Caan, is actually taking this nonsense far too seriously. They're a bit too earnest about this, I think. And if they lightened up a wee bit, I think it might make it a bit more enjoyable. But he's in the meeting with the executive board all on their television monitors.
Yeah.
And he says, we agreed not to harm him, yes, and also we have to, because the whole point of the game was to show that, no one person's bigger than corporations, but that kind of seemed like it was creating a solution in search of a problem. I'm not sure that's what it was. It's like, go back to ancient Rome, which seems valid given the concepts of the film, but the whole bread and circuses thing, and it was like you distract people with sports and give them their bloody delights and things. It wasn't about not having an individual, because sometimes an individual would be quite useful because you'd get people behind him or her, and then not think about the individuals who were in power or anything like that.
Yeah, you make him a figurehead of the corporations.
Yeah, so like the sport itself is a distraction that you don't have to worry about. And if there's a person who comes out and finds a sports person, what can they do?
The other issue I had for it watching it this time was nobody on either of those two teams, New York or Houston, at the end, I think, paid that much attention to what they were being told about the rules. Not about the, no penalties, no substitutions, but no time limit part. Because if you stop to think about that for more than a second, you would never take to the pitch. Yeah, sorry, coach. I was just thinking, under what circumstance does the game actually conclude then? When you're all dead. Sorry, what did you say, coach? It sounded like you said when you're all dead. Did I? Is that what?
Yeah. It doesn't really delve into either the morality of either, because it's all about murder. And like people are dying in that all of the time, and at no point does anybody say, you know what, since this match in particular would have to involve murder and nothing but murder, I'm not going to do that. You could at least have a scene where they're compelled for some reason to do it. But no, it's like, oh no, but that's fine. And also, just a minor sort of technical point, the guy's reading out the rules at the start of that final match, and says, no penalties, no expulsions, no replacements, no time limit. Immediately cuts to a board showing a time limit. Well done. Wonderful editing.
Oh dear. Well.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. A lot of it works quite well, and I appreciate that. And the look's quite interesting, but it's going back to what Scott says, I mean, the pacing's the biggest problem. Take 30 minutes out of this, or just let somebody tighten up the pacing, I think it would be a lot more compelling. And also, what would be more compelling is if, I think, German company responsible for the 4K UHD release had decided to boost all the oranges to within an inch of life, making everybody look like they've been dipped in sunny delight. That was visually repugnant. Like, everybody's been bathing in fake tan. That's an interesting look. That's a technical issue with the restoration and not with the film, of course, but I was struck by quite how orange James Caan looked for a good half of the film.